What is the single worst thing Nintendo has ever done? Admittedly, it's a bit of an odd question, so while you're thinking, here's the official story of the Virtual Boy. In the summer of 1995, Nintendo released the Virtual Boy in Japan and the US to a poor reception. It was discontinued only several months later in Japan and lasted only a year in the United States. That same month, the Virtual Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo after 3 decades of service. Here's another question for you. Why did Gunpei Yokoi leave Nintendo? You might assume it had something to do with the Virtual Boy, but according to Yokoi and the other staff at Nintendo, that's purely a coincidence. Yet the supposed myth has lived on. Even the president of Nintendo of America at the time, Howard Lincoln, made the same assumption while speaking to the press. But to this day, Nintendo insists Yokoi always wanted to retire by the age of 55. But if that's true, his next decision would be considered counterintuitive. He persuaded several of his colleagues to leave Nintendo as well. And stranger yet, he founded a new company to create a new handheld console, putting himself in direct competition with his former employer. To put it bluntly, the official story doesn't make very much sense. So what do you say we tell it again, but this time in detail? The 1990s had just kicked off and so had the Super Nintendo. Nintendo had continued its decade of success in the video game market, despite the growing competition in the field. Some of the top brass, including Gunpei Yokoi, take a meeting with Reflection Technology Inc., a group of developers from Massachusetts with a rather unique bit of hardware involving mirrors and red lights. Allegedly, the rest of the staff is impressed, but Yokoi sees the possibilities of a new kind of game, one where the player would be in complete isolation. For Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi, Yokoi's interest was as good as gold. Yamauchi had no vision for video games, but Yokoi had been a diligent, faithful, and perhaps most importantly, enthusiastic employee since the 1960s, inventing all sorts of toys and amusements until joining the company's foray into video games, creating the Game & Watch handheld, the Famicom controller, the clamshell design that was later adopted by the Nintendo DS, Rob the Robot, and even the very concept of the D-pad all came from the overly excited hands of Yokoi. After developing the NES Zapper for Duck Hunt based on his previous amusements, he noticed the market began to flood with light guns. Rather than compete with himself, he set his sights on creating the first major handheld console, the Game Boy. In short, he valued innovation over refinement, and he would often repeat his personal philosophy of seeking out withering technology, hardware that had aged past the point of market desire, not only providing cheap resources, but an endless source of use case data that could then be applied to prolong battery life. Frankly, there was no one else besides Yokoi who saw the potential in reflection technology. Numerous companies were disinterested in the head-tracking hardware because of its limitations. If anyone could turn it into a compelling piece of technology, it was Yokoi. And his answer was his most forward-facing yet, literally. Virtual reality, a burgeoning technology which had been attempted in several different methods. However, due to the cutting-edge nature, other areas of Nintendo had concerns, specifically the legal department. A user completely covering their eyes and moving at all was a no-go, and so the head-tracking technology gave way to an elevated platform where the user would push their face inward. Legal still felt the overall nearness of the user's face to an active computer could run the risk of radiation, and so additional resources were spent to cover the CPU. Allegedly, around this time, Gunpei Yokoi started to get cold feet, feeling the changes no longer reflected the charm of the initial concept. But unfortunately for Yokoi, there was a big blue spiky elephant in the room. It's often been said that Sega's eventual departure from the home console market began due to their internal squabbling between the American and Japanese divisions, as well as the over-reliance on accessories like the Sega CD, which connected to the popular Sega Genesis. Nintendo had gone from near-complete market dominance in the high 80 percentile to losing half of their audience to Sonic the Hedgehog. And while first-hand accounts are virtually non-existent, journalist Benj Edwards has written about an internal excitement from the United States division of Nintendo, who were just about to enter their extra edgy Play It Loud marketing campaign. The idea of a virtual reality system for home market seemed like just the counterblow to the rumored 32X still coming to the Sega Genesis. The Virtual Boy was no longer Yokai's side project, it was coming to the market. Now, we already know the ending to this story, but President Yamauchi didn't. As a man who viewed everything as business and customer relations, he recognized several tech giants attempting to take a piece of Nintendo's ever-shrinking pie. Panasonic, Gold Star, and others joined the 3DO company. Sony, after a brief flirtation with Nintendo, decided to launch their own 32-bit console. Atari would strike back with the Jaguar, and even Nintendo had roped themselves into licensing their properties to Philips and their upcoming CDI. Meanwhile, Nintendo's own next-gen efforts, Project Reality, had come into several issues, causing substantial years-long delays into 1996. Now flat-footed and surrounded by next-gen machines, Yamauchi would arrange several plans to keep Nintendo modern, including a partnership with Satellaview to produce interactive radio dramas right on the Super Nintendo. Yamauchi would tell Yokai to begin preparations for the launch of the Virtual Boy. But this is where the story becomes strange. According to an interview from Gunpei Yokoi, he had several ideas for the Virtual Boy that would attract the conventional Nintendo user. However, when he explained his concepts to Yamauchi, the president would outright deny them, encouraging Yokoi to seek new ideas that would help differentiate the Virtual Boy. It was certainly a challenge, or perhaps an act of faith, but in another unconventional turn, Yamauchi did not want wide-scale third-party development. Instead, only a handful of trusted third-party developers would be given development kits. This method had been practiced in the early days of the Famicom, but considering the rate at which developers were moving to Sega consoles, it seemed a bit odd to disinclude them. Ultimately, the Virtual Boy would see a rather routine selection of games, not unlike the Game Boy. Galactic Pinball would create a 3D stereoscopic sense of having a gigantic pinball machine right at your face that could travel through multiple levels. Red Alarm bore a striking resemblance to Star Fox, featuring wireframe ships battling in three-dimensional stages. Roboxer adopted the mechanics of the popular Punch-Out franchise, but in an extra dynamic first-person perspective. And Mario would join as well, although in an unfamiliar form. The very first Mario Tennis debuted on the Virtual Boy, showcasing the 3D perspective. Although his bitter rival, recently introduced on the Game Boy, Wario would also receive its second platformer in as many years in Virtual Boy Wario Land. But perhaps the most telling is Mario Clash, a game which features the signature mascot of Nintendo recreating his arcade roots but in 3D. When later asked about the Virtual Boy, Yokoi made a comparison to his fellow co-worker Shigeru Miyamoto, saying that if Miyamoto could make such big worlds like Super Mario 64, there should also be a space for smaller Nintendo games like Mario Clash. In fact, Miyamoto would have limited involvement with the Virtual Boy, as he was already intensely busy with the Nintendo 64 and Super Mario 64. In later interviews, Miyamoto would look back at the Virtual Boy as a fun toy, but believed its treatment as a real video game console is what held it back. He lamented not having more control within the company to implement his suggestions. And to his credit, the marketing around the Virtual Boy pushed it as a futuristic piece of technology that would introduce hardcore players to the next generation of gameplay. But Yokoi never intended his games to chase the hardcore market, which explains why so many of the launch titles were in 2D. In fact, he was adamant that the Virtual Boy was an effort to reverse the direction of game design back to casual audiences that had purchased his Game & Watch and Game Boy creations. The controller featured 2 D-pads and relaxed the hand naturally. Yokoi had seen what the Nintendo 64, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn were offering: highly complex games with unusual controllers that would test the mettle of hardcore players. He wanted to create an experience that could easily be enjoyed by anyone, envisioning games that would be driven not by skill but emotion, such as a video game that could be played in the dark, with its intention to scare the user. This would be years before the popularization of survival horror. After a brief announcement in 1994, the Virtual Boy would launch on July 21, 1995 in Japan and August 14, 1995 in America for $180, as well as a thrifty $10 option to rent out the system and 2 games at the rental chain Blockbuster Video. Despite selling several 100,000 units and even briefly eclipsing the Sega Saturn in sales, the failure was felt almost immediately. The practical red LEDs, which provided a robust 7 hours of battery life with 6 AA batteries, was routinely mocked by the gaming press as ugly, and the launch games as shallow. After all, most of them were still in 2D, but it was certainly better than what the Virtual Boy had experienced in Japan, as several newly implemented laws required Nintendo to provide an extensive list of warnings. Rather than listing potential issues, this law required strange hypotheticals to be entertained and discouraged. But this had the adverse effects of misleading the public about the dangers of the Virtual Boy. By December, less than 6 months after the launch of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo would discontinue the console in Japan, a territory that had routinely received more hardware like the Famicom Disk System when compared to the West. Not to mention the release date for the Virtual Boy in Europe was yet to be announced. it would never come. Nintendo had already attempted price cuts, but American retail chains like Toys R Us began selling units for less than $50. And even then, they simply weren't moving. In August of 1996, a year after its launch, Nintendo discontinued the Virtual Boy in the West. And this had been more than a brief commitment. Nintendo had gone so far as to build a special plant to manufacture the consoles in China. That same month, Gunpei Yokoi would tenure his resignation, a shock to many, as the traditions of Japanese business at the time implied lifelong commitments, especially for successful employees. But this culture included its own pitfalls, and according to several journalists and video game historians, Yokoi did see the most severe punishment possible: a window seat, a term referencing a respected employee whose termination would be seen as dishonorable and instead are given small tasks well below their ability as to not interfere with the more valuable projects. But Nintendo, Miyamoto, and Yokoi have outright denied this, claiming Yokoi had always intended to leave Nintendo but delayed his retirement to aid in the development of the Virtual Boy. However, this raises several questions. If Yokoi delayed his retirement until the Virtual Boy failed, what's the difference? If Yokoi always planned to retire at this time, why would Nintendo invite the awkward optics? If Yokoi always planned to retire, why did he immediately start a new company and immediately start work on a new handheld? Rumors have since swirled that Yokoi had never intended the final version of the Virtual Boy to ever see release, and it was only done in accordance to President Yamauchi's wishes. But didn't Yamauchi trust Yokoi? Or had Yokoi never raised his objections, much like Shigeru Miyamoto? Sadly, this story doesn't have clean answers, only more questions. On March 4th, 1999, Bandai would launch the Wonder Swan, Gunpei Yokoi's final contribution to the video game industry, and one he sadly wouldn't live to see. Tragically, on October 4th, 1997, Yokoi passed away after being struck by a passing vehicle. At the time, Nintendo was promoting the new Game Boy Pocket, a revision created by Yokoi after witnessing the growing popularity of small cell phones. Even in death, Yokoi was still ahead of the curve, and ultimately proven right over the direction of bigger and better games. Between the Nintendo 64 and Nintendo GameCube, Nintendo continued to lose market share to more advanced consoles like Sony's PlayStation or Microsoft's Xbox. Nintendo continued to make much more powerful accessories like the 64DD, which was also a failure for Nintendo in the 1990s and never even left Japan. Costs were climbing and profits were shrinking. Nintendo needed a new philosophy, and it would sound awfully familiar. For the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DS, Nintendo utilized technology that had already been perfected elsewhere that was decidedly cheaper than focusing solely on horsepower and graphics. In fact, that philosophy was also applied to the Nintendo Switch and its NVIDIA chipset. Had Yokoi lived, it's impossible to know what sort of stories he would have shared about his time at Nintendo. But given the work culture at the time and the importance of optics, it's doubtful we'll ever see the full story. Which brings us back to our first question. What's the single worst thing Nintendo has ever done? But how about we flip it and ask, what's the single best thing Nintendo has ever done? Was it the Famicom controller? The Game Boy? The invention of the D-pad? If any of those are worthy of discussion, so is the legacy of the great Gunpei Yokoi. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. Have you ever played a Virtual Boy? How about telling us your experience in the comments below? Keep clicking around here on Game Rant, and we'll see you next time.